Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. My dear participants, there was some technological problem because of which we had to hold our session for about 7 or 8 minutes. We are now just about to start. I'm just checking if everything is in order. Uh, I hope you are able to see the screen. In case you're able to see the screen, just let me know if there's a problem. The screen is being shared to the best of my knowledge because it says that the screen is okay. So let us begin with our session today. And verse that I have selected today is from Surah Maida. It's verse 35, and it's a very, very important verse because of the fact that misinterpreted and the way that it has been generally put forth is entirely different. Uh, Let me start off by reciting to you and then a simple translation. It says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu taqullaha wabtaghu ilayhi al-wasila wajahidu fi sabilihi la'allakum tuflihun. It means believers fear God, fairness for this, and for this strive for his cause so that you may prosper. I hope I'm being heard. Okay. So the verse is actually generally translated as believers fear God and seek something, some means to go near Him, seek some means to procure His nearness, and this is because the word wasila actually is translated rather in its Urdu sense than what it actually means in its English, in its Arabic sense. You see, in Urdu, wasila does mean means or something that can become a way to go to something else. It could be something of a middleman sort of a thing. So if this Urdu meaning of the word is translated the way we generally do, then it would mean that, oh believers, fear God and find some means of find some wasila to Him. And this, of course, would then ratify the view of people who think that we need to reach the Almighty through some wasila, through some mediator, through some intercession. The Almighty is not accessible directly. He has to be accessed through some mediator. And you would know that this is how the whole business of polytheism actually has sprung up in ancient times. One of the reasons for this is that people think that the Almighty is aloof and He can only be reached through His through certain beings, through certain mediators who will be facilitating this contact between the divine and the human. And as I said, one of the pitfalls in understanding Arabic is that at times, instead of realizing that the Arabic words have an Arabic nuance, it has a meaning which specifically relates to the Arabic word and does not have the same meaning as it does in the Urdu language. Uh, it is because of this that many misconceptions have arisen. You see, you need to understand that in linguistics, we call this phenomena as false cognates. You see, the word wasila is used in Arabic, and the word wasila is so both are words of two different languages, exactly the same words, but a note of point here is that the word wasila in Arabic has an entirely different meaning than the word wasila in Urdu. And it would be erroneous to think that both have the same meaning. And it is perhaps because of this that we see that this verse has been translated, and it has actually given rise to the fact that people think that this verse is actually asking us to find a wasila to God, to find a means, an intermediary to God, because they think the word wasila means in that intermediary. However, in Arabic, wasila does not mean intermediary. In Arabic, wasila means nearness itself. So, what the verse is actually telling us is not that we should find some intermediary to reach God. On the other hand, it's telling us that we must reach God directly. We have to find our own direct route to God. There is no intermediary, there is no person in between us and the Almighty. And as long as we have the right protocols vis-a-vis approaching Him, we do not need any person in between us. And viewers, I need to highlight this little more because of the fact that at times we don't understand that how these false cognates come into being. False cognates, or as in French or in German, we call them as false Freunde, which means they're false friends. And false friends here means that the words are the same in both languages, but the meaning is different. So, to give you an example, another example which I commonly give is that the word ghaliz, if you look at its connotation, obviously in Arabic, ghaliz has a different meaning than its meaning in Urdu. In Urdu, the word ghaliz means filthy, as you all know. However, in Arabic, the word ghaliz means strong, something which is very sturdy. And that is why the nikah has been called as misakan ghaliza in Arabic. Misakan ghaliza would mean that it's a strong bond, it's a strong contract. It, of course, would not mean that it's a filthy contract because the word ghaliz, although it's common to both Arabic and Urdu, has a different meaning in both languages. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this is a common mistake that we come across, that because the words being common, we also translate them in this way without realizing that in spite of this commonness, the meanings may be different in different languages, although they could be same as well, but many a time they are different as well. So coming back to the verse that we are discussing, that it is essential to understand that this verse is actually telling us that we need to come closer to God as far as we can. And viewers, this is something that we have been discussing all along this study circle, that our biggest need is to connect with God. And I this as God connection. We have to have a strong connection with God. We have to have a very, very direct connection to God because as individuals, all of us need His support. As individuals, all of us have to have some reliance on someone on whom we can always depend. He is the support on whom we can always depend. The closest of supports might be of no use to us because we cannot confide all our secrets, all our inner thoughts to everyone. And you see, I've also made this point a couple of times, maybe earlier as well, that one of the greatest contributions of the Quran is that it provides us with a very, very detailed introduction to God. So if we want to, of course, the thirst of God is there in our own intuition. We know that there is a God who exists. However, what are his attributes, what is he like, and how does he deal with his creatures. So this needs a detailed introduction, and the biggest one of the biggest, I would say, resources of this is the Quran itself. It guides us very elaborately vis-a-vis how we need to understand our creator, what are his likes and dislikes, how he interacts with human beings, and how are his attributes related to us. So the verse here is telling us that we need to come closer to God. And it's not just saying that we have to come closer to God, viewers. It's saying it is actually ending on even a more important note, and that is وَجَاهِدُوا فِي سَبِيلِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. It says that if you have to come closer to God, if you have to come closer and more closer to God, then there is a way out, then there is a solution, then there is a methodology to this, and that is strive for His cause. وَجَاهِدُوا فِي سَبِيلِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ, so that you may prosper. So in order to come closer to God, we have to do something which actually enhances and supports His own cause, which of course is the cause of religion itself. So, whatever we can do for the cause of religion is something which will make us come closer to God. And for this, of course, furthering the cause of religion by spreading anything that comes to our hand and we think that we can communicate it, maybe just handing over a copy of the Quran to other people, or a selection of hadiths to other people, or anything which relates to religion, the biography of the Prophet, or maybe even, of course, helping people understand religion, helping people in educating themselves in religion, giving money for the cause of religion, for example, for the construction of libraries which relate to religious thought, or to education institutions in which religion is taught. So, all these are causes of the Almighty. All these are the causes through which we can support the religion of the Almighty. So, the verse is actually telling us that one way of coming closer to God is that we have to strive for His cause. We have to do something for His cause. And as the Latin phrase very aptly says, opus Dei means God's work. So we need to adopt something for ourselves which we can say as that it's God's work. So something which constitutes God's work, that has to be taken upon by us as a responsibility, as an obligation. And if we do that, as the verse says, that this will be a means of bringing us closer to the Almighty. So, of course, there are other means, for example, worshiping Him, for example, praying before Him, doing charitable works. But here, the stress is that we have to work for the cause of the Almighty. And the cause of the Almighty, of course, here relates to the cause of His religion. And the cause of His religion would, of course, mean that how this religion can be promoted, it can be furthered amongst people, misconceptions removed among people. This is one of the greatest things or greatest tasks that lies as a challenge before Muslims of today. And of course, this also constitutes serving the cause of the of Almighty's religion, because when we try to remove all sorts of misconception that today prevail in the name of Islam and go under the label of Islam and actually have no link to Islam, then we are doing a great service. So, just to conclude this Quranic verse, it is all important to realize that we have to serve the Almighty through our own capacities, our own humble capacities, and as much as we can. This will, of course, be directly proportional to bringing us closer to the Almighty. And then the last part of the verse tells us, لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. This is actually how we may prosper, how we may achieve success. So, real success, as you can see, as defined by the Quran, is to come closer to God. So, success to us is how much closer to God that we can get. And for this, how much of work that we can do for the cause of the Almighty. Here now we've come to the second part of our study circle, and this is a hadith that we generally study. So the hadith that we have selected today is from the Sahih of Imam Muslim. Let me just read out the words of the hadith, and then we will discuss it. So it says, it's from Amr ibn Auf. أخبره أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال فوالله ما الفقر أخشى عليكم ولكني أخشى عليكم أن تبسط الدنيا عليكم كما بسطت على من كان قبلكم فتنافسوها كما تنافسوها وتهلككم كما أهلكتهم. So this hadith means that Amr ibn Auf actually reported that God's messenger said, by God, it's not poverty which I fear for you. However, I fear that you be given abundance in wealth the way those before you were given. Then you begin to compete with one another for them as they did, and this may destroy you as it destroyed them. So you see, this is such an important piece of advice which the Prophet is given. And he, of course, realizing the fact that all of us have to pass through various tests and trials. And one of these tests and trials relates to our financial abilities and our financial status. So there are people who are born poor and they remain poor, or they are, in spite of all their trying and their strivings, they still remain of a society. And there are people who are born rich, they remain rich, and they command the society, and they have always all the good things in the society. The important thing here to note is that whether you're born rich or whether you're born poor, we have to realize that being rich or being poor is actually a form of trial from the Almighty. And this is how we are tested and tried by the Almighty. This is one of the ways in which we are tested and tried by the Almighty. But look what the Prophet is telling us. He is saying that it is not poverty that he fears for us more than affluence, because affluence tends to take us away from the Almighty. Poverty is also a form of trial, and of course, affluence is also a form of trial. But affluence is something which is always some instrumental in taking us away from the Almighty. It could be a very strong source of taking us away from the Almighty. So the Prophet is reported to have said that I fear that you be given abundance in wealth the way those before you were given, and then you begin to compete with one another. So there is this dash for acquiring more wealth. Greed breeds greed. Wealth, there is no end to it. So the Prophet is actually trying to caution and prod us that if you need to understand that people before us have been destroyed because in their dash for wealth, in their dash to acquire more and more, to their greed. And they began with wealth and they ended up in wealth. And all their life was spent in amassing wealth. And this, of course, was a means of taking them away from the Almighty, far away from the Almighty. And that is why the Prophet is saying that if you have poverty, if you are afflicted with this poverty, you need to understand that although both are forms of trial, but poverty perhaps is a lesser trial in the form that it still connects you with the Almighty, because you don't lose this connection with God, because there's this chance that whenever we are in such straitened circumstances, we do connect to God more than we do when we live in affluent circumstances. And the other thing which the Prophet has pointed out here is that this not just affluence that takes us away, or might be instrumental in taking us away from the Almighty. It's this competition between people. It's this dash and this race between people to outdo one another in acquiring more and more wealth. We know that another verse of the Quran has said precisely what we have just discussed here. It says, Al-Hakumut takasur hatta zurtumul makabir. That this dash of outdoing each other in acquiring wealth has made us reach our graves, which means that it's like a lifelong dash. We don't end, there's no end to it. And we need to understand we have to prioritize our lives. Of course, wealth is not a bad thing. To be a rich person or affluence in itself is nothing bad. It's only when affluence and richness takes us away from our priorities, only when it makes us indifferent to the requisites that are our obligations towards God and towards our fellow human beings, do we need to understand that this is something of a very, very heavy trial. So, as a note of caution, we need to understand that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, to his own ummah, is actually spelling out some of the very important trials that they may face. And one of them is that if they are given abundance in wealth, this could actually lead them far away from the Almighty. They must make a conscious effort, a very conscious effort, that if they are people who have been given wealth and they have a very smooth life, because you see, when life is smooth, when everything is going well, you seldom think of the Almighty, you seldom think of the hereafter. There is this chance that you forget the hereafter. So it is here that the Prophet is trying to tell us, or trying to caution us, that richness and affluence must not make us indifferent to the hereafter. We must, of course, thank God for being affluent, for giving us these blessings, but at the same time, we must not overindulge ourselves in them so as to lose track of our real priorities. Viewers, now let us come to the third part of our first session, which is the Bible verse of the day. And the Bible verse that I have selected is this time from the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter number 22, verses 1 to 3. And let me just read out the text before you. It says, If you see your brother's ox or his sheep wandering, do not go by without helping, but take them back to your brother. If their owner is not near, or if you are not certain who he is, then take the beast to your house and keep it till its owner comes in search of it, and then you are to give it back to him. Do the same with his ass or his robe or anything which has gone from your brother's keeping, and which you have come across. Do not keep it to yourself. So this is a very simple and a very affectionate advice being given here from Moses, and that is that when you find something which has been lost by other people, it could be an animal, because the frame in which the book of Deuteronomy was set, the time period in which it was set, was of course the time in which people would own animals, and they would hunt, and they were hunter gatherers, and maybe animals were kept not only for their own livestock but also for their own living. So having an animal was a very common thing in those cultures, in those tribal cultures. So an equally common thing would be that people would lose their animals, or their animals would lose track, and they would wander away. So the bottom line here, which the Prophet Moses is telling us here, is whether it's a sheep or a cow or an ox or a camel which has wandered away, or maybe anything else, or a robe, or anything which is possessed by other people, you need to find out its real owner. And for that, if you have to take that thing temporarily to your own house, to store it, to lock it up, so that if the owner comes and search for it, you are able to hand it back to him or her, then this is like a trust that you have on behalf of that person. You must not use it for your own self. It's like being entrusted with someone other's possession, and this possession has to be returned back to that owner. It should not be think we should not think that that's something if we have found down the road, or maybe come across any way, then that belongs to us. We have to take pains in trying to find the real owner. And today we know that there are whole sets of departments who go along doing this. Lost and found, for example, is a department in most countries in which things which are lost are reported there, and people are actually informed that if they have lost anything, then they can check with such a department. So I think modern day countries, they do follow this very sound advice, but at the same time, if this is a department which does not exist in our country, we have to try to do it individually as far as we can, and ultimately try to find the owner. And if at all the owner does not cannot be searched for, he's not been located, then perhaps what best can be done is to that thing, whatever we have found, in charity, or to give it away to some charitable institution. But again, a reasonable amount of time must be spent as far as go in finding out the person or the real owner. And again, as you can see, that this is a very, very simple and a small and a compact act of kindness. And you can clearly see how prophets of God take this upon themselves, that they would like to inform their ummah, their people, that any small act of kindness that comes their way, they should not lose track of it. They should not think that it's something very ordinary or very trivial. No, every good act is something which always contributes to our own spiritual purification. Spiritual enhancement is the goal of all of us, and small acts of kindness, they always help us. They always make us must be on the lookout to find these small ways and means to help people. And in fact, this would be helping our own selves. When we help other people, it's like helping our own selves, because all this good that we do to others is ultimately returned to us in some form or the other. So, view this brings us to the end of the first session of our study circle here. We have discussed some of the important points that have been raised in the Quran and the Hadith and the Bible sections. So, before we go on, if you have any questions regarding the content that we have studied, we can discuss that. Otherwise, we will be going on and studying the next part of our study section. So I do not see any hands raised, which would mean that we can continue perhaps and go on to the next session. Okay, so going on to the next part of our study circle, my dear viewers, that the misconception that I'd like to described before you or discussed before you relates to a very important area regarding the Quran. You see, the Quran, as we all know, is a document which all of us study in some part of our lives. It could be in the very initial period of our life, and we are made to go through certain surahs of the Quran. It could be in a later part of our lives. But one important misconception about the Quran is regarding the genre of the book that we read so profusely without perhaps having a fair idea of the category of the book which the Quran belongs to. Because you see, we have before us various examples in the human plane. We have literature in prose, we have literature in poetry, we have rhymed literature, we have various forms of literature, which includes story writing, which includes historical writing, which includes drama, play, fiction. So there are so many forms of literature that we are well aware of that at times we get confused as to which genre does the Quran belong to. And viewers, we must realize that the Quran itself is a masterpiece of literature. It's one of the most outstanding pieces of literature that we can come across. But in order to gauge the fact that what exactly is the genre of the Quran, we need to draw certain examples from our human plane, and this would perhaps bring us closer to what the genre of the Quran is. And just to give you a very rudimentary example or a comparison, you can see that the Quran resembles in its essence very much and very closely to the genre of literature which we call as drama or playwriting. You see, there are characters in a play, and then within a play, we find scenes and acts shifting rapidly, and we see people talking to each other in the form of dialogue. So we have monologue, we have a soliloquy, we have dialogue between people. So just as in a drama, there are certain characters who converse with one another, and this conversation rapidly shifts back and forth, and at the same time, scenes change, a new scene comes up, acts change, a new act comes up. In a very similar way, the Quran actually, if you try to analyze the genre of the Quran, the category of the Quran, it resembles this drama or a play very much, because we have characters, but here, of course, the characters are real life characters which have enacted themselves on the stage of the 7th or 6th century Arabia. We have characters like the people of the book, we have characters like the hypocrites, Satan himself, and then, of course, the author of this divine dialogue, if you allow me to say, is the Almighty Himself. So He also converses and speaks back and forth to the peoples and various groups of people. So it's like people conversing with one another, and this conversation being shifted back and forth between various denominations which are present. And as you can see that in the case of a drama or a play, what is very easy to find out is who is speaking to whom. Because in the human plane, whenever we write a drama or a play, we always write the person who is speaking. We always write his name first, and then a colon, and then whatever he utters or she utters is followed by. In the case of the Quran, this is not so. We have to understand the person who is speaking, and we have to understand the person who he or she is speaking to at the same time. And this changes rapidly as well. And much of the disjointedness in the Quran that we at times see, these huge shifts which take place, is because of this particular category of the Quran, in which the dialogue is changing between people, in which people keep coming and going. For example, the Almighty is speaking to a particular group of people regarding their particular beliefs, and suddenly there's something which happens, and He turns His face to another group of people who are standing right behind or right besides them, and He starts talking to them. So it's like right, left, and center. The direction of address is shifting. And if we don't have an idea of this shift, we do tend to think that perhaps the Quran has a lot of disjointedness, a lot of incoherence in it. There's no sequence in the discourse because things shift from one place to another. At times, it is difficult to even think or realize that who is speaking to whom, and we need to sort of be very careful and very methodological and very meticulous in finding out who is the person who is speaking. And then we have this phenomena in which at times what people who are spoken to, they are actually not spoken to, which means that the direction of address is to some people, but the message given is actually to another set of people. So there are this subtlety of address, which we can call that the Quran is like a book of dialogues set in 7th century Arabia, in which people are conversing with one another, in which, of course, the Almighty is also figuring, He's also conversing. He's, in fact, the author of these divine dialogues, and then the scenes and the acts are also shifting. And the thing as a result, dear viewers, is that the most important thing that we need to realize here is that if we do not find something in the Quran which does not relate to 7th century Arabia, then this should not be any cause of concern to us, because you see, as I said, the book is laid out in this tapestry, in this milieu of 7th century Arabia. For example, Buddhism or Hinduism is not discussed in the Quran. Why? Because, as I said, eh, the book is discussing real life issues that were present in 7th century Arabia. Hinduism or Buddhism were not there in Arabia at that time. So, if someone asks that why is it that the Quran is not discussing two major religions of today, it is because it is set in a particular environment in which those religions were not present in Arabia. Of course, we do have, by analogy, a lot of directions and directives from the Quran, in the light of which we can see how Hinduism or Buddhism perhaps need to be evaluated. But directly, Hinduism or Buddhism is not discussed in the Quran, simply because the 7th century Arabian setting does not have them there. And the other thing that we need to understand is that there would be certain things that would be specific to the Quran, and some of those specific things, of course, relate to the groups or denominations which were present in Arabia in those times. Just to give you an example, we know that Uzair was regarded by the Jews of Arabia to be the son of God. Now, this particular branch of Jews was only present in Arabia. And this was not the belief of all the Jews or other Jews of living in other parts of the world. Hence, this is another example of the fact that we find a lot of localized things within the Quran, localized settings and localized beliefs, which might not be as universal as what one might expect. So we have to understand the genre of the Quran, the category of the Quran, that it is basically a set in 7th century Arabia. It's in the form of a drama enacted, a real life drama enacted between real life and real time characters who conversed with one another. And this conversation, in the form of dialogues with all its subtleties, has been preserved and has been enshrined eternally in the Quran. And if we have this background of this genre of the Quran, this category of the Quran, especially if we want to educate our young ones, the next generation, regarding the Quran, and before actually handing them over the Quran, we are able to introduce the Quran to them, it would be much better an undertaking. And instead of handing over the Quran, if we make them comfortable with the Quran, make them acclimatized, so to speak, with the Quran by telling them what sort of the book it is, and what sort of the book that they need to expect when they read the Quran, it would be much more worthwhile. Similarly, it would be the case with any uninitiated reader of the Quran, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, to give them this introduction that this is a book of dialogues between people, and this dialogue nature of the Quran, if it is not understood the way it occurs in the Quran, one may think that there are a lot of bumps and jolts and disjointedness in the Quran, because we would fail to realize how subjects come up and how subjects are discussed in the Quran, especially in the style of classical and ancient Arabic. So this would bring me to the end of this session as well, my dear viewers, that I've tried to bring up this misconception before you, that the Quran itself, the genre of the Quran itself, some people have regarded to be prosaic poetry or poetry, semi-poetry or rhyme prose, or a book of quotations, or maybe a book in which a certain facts have been gathered in a certain way. But all in all, the exact category and genre of the Quran is that it's a book of dialogues in the form of a drama, in which characters speak to each other, and hence these characters are, although localized, but then the message that they give, or the message that they convey, is universal, is has a universal appeal. The language itself, the content itself might be localized, but the message that they give us is something which is for all times to come. So I think if this with this small introduction of the Quran, I will now leave it to you to if you have any questions regarding this genre of the Quran or any of the earlier discussions that we have been doing. So you are now free to ask questions, and please, I can just raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll just unmute your mic. Okay, I do have a question which says that what is the central idea of the Quran by Mr. Mateen Tahir? Uh, well, this is a slightly detailed discussion that would warrant some idea regarding the central idea of the Quran. But just to give a very brief introduction in a quick way, I can say that the central theme of the Quran, or the central idea of the Quran, is a very important topic, and that is that it is actually it depicts the divine warning from the for the Prophet Muhammad for the last time, and this divine warning or for want of a better word, we what in Arabic what we call as inzar, that it is basically warning people that if they do not accept the truth, then they will be punished in the hereafter. And an example of this punishment is this empirical evidence which took place in Arabia and in uh, and people who were before them in Arabia, that lesser days of judgment were actually created on the face of this earth, in which messengers of God would deliver the truth on behalf of the Almighty. And if people intentionally denied that truth, then they would be punished. And this would become a rehearsal of that greater day of judgment. So, in a nutshell, you can say that the scheme of or the theme of the Almighty in the Quran is to warn people judgment in a way that that warning has become visualized and enshrined in the Quran, because that warning, though it actually ended up in the worldly retribution of people in Arabia, and this is shown so that people they don't get they don't forget the hereafter, and as a result, also you need to realize that there are certain directives which are specific to the first period of the Quran, which is the first era of of religious history, which of course is the prophetic era. So, if we can divide the religious history of mankind into two distinct eras, one is the prophetic era, which is the era in which the Almighty interacted with His creatures directly through prophets of God, and that ended with Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then there's this post-prophetic era, which extends all the way to the day of judgment. So the Quran is a book which belongs to the prophetic era, and in this prophetic era, it has preserved that warning regarding the day of judgment, which is the central idea of the Quran. So we have another question which says that would you be answerable to every possession you have even when you have passed away? Of course, you see, we will be answerable for whatever we have, and we will be answerable for all our possessions. And of course, this would be on account of what we have. We know that according to the law of inheritance, whatever we have will be distributed once we pass away. So, of course, that would account for that. Uh, so we have another question, and that is that. So, sorry, it says turn on the volume. Okay. So I guess that this is the what we have discussed today, and uh, If there has been any problem with some people, as they say they're not properly being able to hear the lecture, they can perhaps email the administration to ask them what the problem was. But because as far as I'm concerned, I can see all the controls working here in a very meticulous way, and it seems that they're all working. Okay, I have another question here from Shumaila Khalid, which says that even if you pay zakat and you earn money with halal means, so even if you pay, the question is actually not very clear. Uh, Even if you pay zakat through halal means, so you see, whatever you do in your own life, you're answerable for that. Of course, if you have wealth in your own life, you should pay zakat. But once you pass away, paying zakat is not your own liabilities. The wealth that remains is distributed according to the law of inheritance to various people, heirs, which are the spouses, the parents, and the children. And once this distribution has taken place, zakat is now the responsibility of the heirs. It's not the responsibility of the person who has passed away, because zakat is something which is always imposed when a person is living. When he passes away or when she passes away, this responsibility is transferred to the heirs of that person. So I think that with this, there are no there are I don't see any more questions or any more hands being raised up. If you need to ask a question, it's you can just raise your hands. There is this box which says raise hands. You can, if you click on it, I can unmute your mic so that you can Okay, I do have another question from Adila Asad, and she says, what categories would Hindus and Buddhists fall in from among the kuffar or the mushrikun? So, as far as the Buddhists and the Hindus are concerned, actually, we need to find out first of all what they believe in. So, as far as Hindus are concerned, they do believe in more than one God. We know that for to them, the Bhagwan is the ultimate God. But then there are other demigods, as we would say, who exist and who take the believers of the Hindu religion to God or to the one supreme God who is Bhagwan. So yes, one commonality between Hindus and the mushrikun of Arabia is that they do believe in polytheism. They are basically polytheists, and as polytheists, of course, they would be categorized among the mushrikun. However, the as far as the fact is concerned that what would be our behavior towards people who are Buddhists or people who are mushriks or Hindus. Again, as I said, that in the post-prophetic era, in which prophets of God no longer come, in which those lesser days of judgment are no longer set up, we have to deal very, very amicably and very friendly with all people of all religions. And in this particular area, we have to understand that it is the prerogative of the Almighty to decide the fate of a person. We have to leave the fate of a person to the Almighty. Whether a person is a Buddhist or whether a person is a Hindu, it should not matter to us as long as we are good to them and expect the same from them. And whenever there is a chance to exchange views, we are able to do so. So, classifying them is also not a very appropriate thing as far as judging them is concerned. Of course, if we have to classify them regarding certain statutes of the Quran, that could be one thing. But if you have to judge them by something, then that is something that we cannot even do with the mushrikun of today, whether they are of any country, including in India or maybe other countries like Nepal, which have a lot of Hindus and Buddhists. So, as far as Hinduism and Buddhism is concerned, we need to ask them. We need to know that, of course, they do not believe in God Almighty the way we think they should believe in. But however, at the same time, as far as judging them is concerned, or finding out what their fate will be, is something that is not related to us. It's not befitting. We have to deal with them as individuals, as human beings do, and of course befriend them if the opportunity arises. But other than that, uh, there is no way or means to find out how they will fare in the hereafter. That has to be decided by the Almighty. As far as we are concerned, we will deal with them in a very affectionate, human way, and that is all that we should do. So, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hands, and I will unmute your mic. I don't see any more questions, and so I think that we can now call it a day, and inshallah, then see you next week, same time, same date. Have a very pleasant week. Best wishes, and Khuda Hafiz.